All right, so let's talk about how this information now routes to the brain and what we do with it once we get up there and talk about these nerve pathways. So the first section was looking at the receptors themselves and different types of receptors, now getting into the peripheral nervous system and getting it up to the central nervous system. Like we said, the difference there is the difference between sensation and perception. So sensation is an awareness of those changes, but really the perception is the conscious rather than subconscious interpretation of those stimuli. So generally, like we saw with the central nervous system before, this is going to go to the somatosensory cortex, right? Somatosensory means the information about the body itself, right? Soma means body. But it does get processed along the way as well. So we're going to find that the receptors are going to do a little bit of processing, right? So whether they are being stimulated gently or more severely or quickly or whatever, they're going to respond accordingly. But then when we are doing these ascending pathways, right, going up to the spinal cord, up through the brainstem and through the thalamus, there's going to be some processing. And then finally, we're going to get out to the cortex where we're going to have the perception occurring. So again, the receptor level is what's happening with the receptor itself. The circuit level is as it gets processed through some of the lower brain areas, particularly through the brainstem, depending on what it is, but also through that thalamus, right? The thalamus is like the router. So it does some initial processing, kind of some sorting, kind of like a switchboard operator or whatever. And then for more detailed processing, it's going to send it to the particular areas of that somatosensory cortex, for instance, right? So remember we had that sensory homunculus, different areas of the body. We would send those information to those different parts of that ridge, right? That gyrus. So the thalamus helps to do that. Okay, so like we said, at the receptor level, that's where we're going to be getting that stimulus to the receptor. And so we've got to be able to give it enough of a stimulus for it to generate what's called a generator potential, right? And then ultimately it's going to generate an action potential. So it's going to be releasing neurotransmitters. Once we release enough neurotransmitters to that sensory neuron, then it's going to generate an action potential, and whoop, now the message is going on the way up. So we have to have enough of a stimulus, and it has to be the right stimulus, right? We have different types of receptors based on their modality, right? You can't, for instance, drop a particular chemical. You don't want to put like sugar on top of a photoreceptor and expect it to do anything, right? And it also has to be within its receptive field. So I can't shine a light over here and expect my photoreceptors to do much of anything, right? It has to be within the receptive field. Same thing within our touch receptors. Okay, so this whole process where they're doing that initial grabbing the stimulus, or, if you will, or basically being stimulated by it, and then generating something that the nervous system can understand. We were talking about that, how that's translating it for the nervous system, but more specifically, this is called transduction. Okay? Now, remember that we have to give these receptors enough of a stimulus for them to respond and then relay that message to an afferent neuron. But there are ways that our different receptors can adapt. Now, this is physiological adaptation, right? Not evolutionary adaptation like you would talk about in terms of our Bio 100 class or something like that. And so what we find is that there are certain types of receptors that will adapt through time. So if there's a stimulus, then if that stimulus continues, then they'll start ignoring that. They're like, well, you know, they'll send information into the central nervous system at first when something changes, right? And then if it stays the same, they'll be like, oh, I told you that was going on, so I'm not going to tell you again and again and again. Okay? So, for instance, those that are fast adapting are called phasic receptors. So those ones will turn on and send a signal when something changes, but then as it stays the same, they'll quiet down, and then as that stimulus goes away, then they will send another signal. So they only send a signal in, or they mainly send a signal in, when there's a phase change. Okay? So, for instance, touch, right? So, for instance, when you put your clothes on in the morning, you can feel them. You're like, oh, okay, that's a little bit warmer, or more, well, that's thermoreceptor, right? Or at least you can feel them on there, right? But then after a while, you just forget about it, unless something is really binding and hurting you or something like that, right? So that's an example of adaptation of our phasic receptors. Now, tonic receptors adapt slowly or basically not at all. So as long as that stimulus is on, then they're going to be sending a signal into the brain. So for instance, it's going to make sense that our nociceptors are going to be tonic receptors, right? Because as long as there's something hurting me, I want the central nervous system to know about it. I don't want to be just like, oh yeah, I forgot about that nail going through my foot, right? So phasic and tonic receptors have to do with physiological adaptation. Other things that have to do with this kind of information and getting it into the peripheral nervous system have to do with processing as well. So for instance, identifying the features of that particular structure. So oftentimes, if you were to close your eyes, right, we have touch receptors, but then you're like, oh, there's a bump there, and oh, this part is a little bit kind of tacky, and this part's a little bit slippery, and this is very long, right? So it gives you more information about it. It gives you, for instance, a 3D idea about the particular object. Quality discrimination, submodalities of sensation. So for instance, we have different types of touch, right? We have light touch and we have deep touch. We have different types of chemoreceptors, taste receptors, and things like that. And then pattern recognition. So once I feel, oh, okay, this is a stylus, this is like a pen type of thing, then I get an image of it in my mind. It's like, do I have one of these? Oh yes, this is the one I use for my computer. It's not like a writing one. I just had it in my hand recently, etc. Okay? Okay. Other aspects in terms of perception is perception of pain. Like we said, there's different aspects of it and what our brain, what our central nervous system does with that information. And for instance, there is what's called visceral pain and referred pain, specific types of pain. And when we're looking at these pain receptors and when we're talking about the processing, we said that it's all about different types of neurotransmitters, right? So we saw that there's acetylcholine, there's norepinephrine, but there's all types of other ones as well. There are ones that are stimulatory, there are ones that are inhibitory. So you hear about them sometimes in different types of diseases or disorder, right? You hear about dopamine and dopamine receptors and things like that. There's one that's called GABA. That's an acronym for it because that's a really long chemical name. In the case of pain, these nociceptors tend to use glutamate and substance P. Makes sense, right? P for pain. But they're also unique in terms of what information they're sending. So for instance, we have what's called visceral pain. So rather than surface pain, visceral pain has to do with the guts. There's also referred pain. Now, referred pain is an odd thing. Referred pain is where the organ itself, or the part of your body that is being damaged, isn't necessarily the part of the body that you feel the perceived pain, right? So you talk about people that have a heart attack and they get this pain that goes, along their whole limb or something like that. That's referred pain. There's no heart in the left arm, but they can get pain along the left arm. When you talk about kidneys are generally located, right, like up here, like this. But look at the area that's covered for kidney pain. Any of this area here could be kidney pain, right? Liver, now liver, right, so you have it on the right side there, but sometimes, look at this, you have no liver up there. So that's what's called referred pain, area of the body that seems to be an area that's affected, or at least you feel like pain is coming from that area, even though the organ may not be there. So that's important to know if you're trying to diagnose somebody, right? It's not just, oh, I got a sore joint there. It's like, oh, that might have to do with the liver, even though it's not there. Okay, so let's get this information into the central nervous system using these nerves, right? So nerves, remember way back when we were talking about central nervous system, we were looking at the spinal cord, and we were talking about it being like a big freeway, and we had on-ramps and off-ramps, and as we got away from the spinal cord, we have our spinal nerves, right? There are also cranial nerves too that go to and from the brain, and spinal nerves that go to and from the spinal cord to innervate the body. But all these nerves, what do they look like, right? They're basically bundles. If you imagine a big cable, right? like if you had an internet cable or electrical cable, if you cut it in half, you would see all of these different individual wires within it. And they're going to the same area, right? They might be going to the same neighborhood, and then they branch off from there to go to individual houses. And so that's kind of what we see in terms of nerves themselves. Nerves are bundles of axons that are going to and from a particular area of the body. So these can be spinal nerves, like we said, or cranial nerves, depending on where they originate. And when we look at it, there could be both myelinated neurons in there as well as unmyelinated. They might be just sensory, they might just be motor nerves, but most of them are sensory and motor. Like we talked about, kind of like two-way streets going to and from that area of the body. Now, luckily, the nerves are somewhat organized like the muscles, skeletal muscles that we learned about before. And if we look at the connective tissue organization of these, you should recognize these prefixes, right? Endo, peri, and epi, right? Before it was mesium, like myo, right? Like mes, muscle. Now it's neurium instead. So if we're to look at it, here's a cross-section of a nerve, and a large nerve might even have blood vessels going through the inside. But basically, right, the epineurium is going to be around the whole thing, just like we saw in the muscle. We also have fascicles in it, so you see, there's one here, maybe one here, etc., and one here. Those fascicles are going to be wrapped by perineurium, and then these individual cells, like we saw in the muscle, these individual cells are going to be wrapped by endoneurium, right? So it gives us an organization that we see kind of look like this. This is a graphical representation instead. So we do see bundles again, wrapped by perineurium. Endoneurium is going to be wrapping individual cells, and then epineurium is going to be around the whole thing. And like we said, most of the nerves of the body are going to be what's called mixed nerves, where we have sensory neurons going up to the brain, right, afferent, and we're going to have motor neurons going down through them as well, mixed in that way. We said there are some sensory exclusive and motor exclusive, but they're kind of rare, and we'll highlight those along the way. These nerves, in fact, remember how we were talking about the central nervous system? We said there's not a lot of regeneration or rebuilding or repair that can occur there. It has to do a lot with those oligodendrocytes, right, that are wrapping those myelinated neurons, and they're very complex because they hold a bunch of them. Well, remember the myelination of our peripheral neurons comes from Schwann cells, right, that wrap each individual little section of one neuron. So they think that maybe that has something to do with the fact that these peripheral nerves and neurons can actually regenerate better, right? So the oligodendrocytes and even those astrocytes prevent it in the central nervous system. So when we look at it, if there's damage, what you tend to get is the growth of extensions that will come across and bridge this gap when it's broken. And in fact, the neuron will regrow through the center of it as well. So it's quite possible, right, if you cut through, generally, unless it's a deep cut and you get scar tissue, you will get that nerve regeneration as well, at least in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so let's talk about those different types of nerves, right? So we had cranial nerves and we have spinal nerves. 12 pairs of cranial nerves that we'll be learning in the lab. 12 pairs, that means there's 24, right? Because we have the two sides. And like usual, if we have different types of acronyms or, mnemonics to help us remember them, it can be helpful. So your book gives you a couple. On occasion, our trusty truck acts funny. Very good vehicle. Anyhow, once one takes the anatomy final, very good vacations are heavenly. Why are we having those, right? Once upon a time, there was another one that was to touch and feel very good velvet. So if you look at these phrases, right? To touch and feel very good velvet. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Notice these other phrases also have 12 words to them, right? And the letters are the same. Those are the first letters of those cranial nerves in order. So that can help you on the lab practical or on the lecture exam to know, okay, the first one, that's olfactory, right? Begins with an O, and then Oh, oculomotor is third. Optic nerve, that's two. So it takes a little bit of time, but at least it gives you the hint of the first letter. All right, so here we can see them on the inferior surface of the brain, and you'll notice there are all these little wires, right? Like I said, most of these are mixed. Some of them are exclusive. We'll talk about each one. But notice there's a pattern to them as well. So for instance, 1, 2, and 3 are kind of all in a line that you see there, right? And then when we go to the side, 4, 5, and 4 and 5 are a little bit to the side over there, right? So we can see there's one line through here, one line through there, and then 6, 7, and 8. 6, 7, and 8 starts medial, and then it goes 7 and 8. They're kind of in a line horizontal like this. 9, 10, and 11. So 9, 10, and 11, right? These are Roman numerals. 9, 10, and 11 are kind of bunched together. So you can see 9, 10, 11, and 12 is more medial like you see here. So we can do the same on this side. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to the side. 6, 7, 8 go across in a line. 9, 10, 11 have their own little line like that. And 12's on the medial aspect. Okay, that can help as well, again, to help you figure out the organization of these 12 pairs of cranial nerves as well. All right, so let's take a look at them. Number 1, olfactory. Olfactory means smell, right? So olfactory is a sensory neuron sensory nerve, that's routing chemical information from the nasal cavity, right? So it's routing it into the brain like we saw before. So that's olfactory. Second one is optic. So optic is routing a visual information from the back of the eye, and it's routing it back to the visual cortex in the occipital lobe. Now notice, and we'll talk about this with the special senses as well, there's this crossing over point, right? This is called the optic chiasma, right? So Greek letter chi is an X, so we see a crossing over like that. And so what you get is, for instance, when the eyes are looking at something over here, what we find is this one's going to visualize some of it, and this one's going to visualize some of it, and it's going to end up on this part of the retina, on both eyes. And so that way we can compare the information that those eyes are getting. And so you see that information, it's kind of shown in green. See how it goes, and it goes over to the same side of the brain for processing. So there's kind of this crossing over. But optic nerves are sensory information coming from the eyes themselves. Oculomotor nerves, instead, as the name indicates, are stimulating some of the what's called extrinsic eye muscles. These are skeletal muscles that move the eye. And we need to be able to tell them when to look around, right? Trochlear nerve. So the trochlear nerve, is cranial nerve number 4. And look at this one. So it is innervating one of our skeletal muscles that moves the eye, our extrinsic ones. It is innervating that superior oblique muscle. So the superior oblique muscle is going to be, let's see where we at, right in there. So the superior oblique muscle, that muscle, it comes in and it attaches at an angle, but it passes through this little loop that's called a trochlea. So that's where the nerve gets its name. It's called the trochlear nerve. But that's what it innervates. It tells that one muscle when to move. Then we look at cranial nerve number 5. This is called the trigeminal. Trigeminal has 3 different areas of the face that it's going to innervate. Excuse me. So when we look at it, this one, we're going to be innervating. You can see all of these different pathways. Remember when we were going through the skull and we found all these different foramina? So this generally allows us to innervate, allow these nerves to pass through those areas. So we can see that there is superior orbital fissure, so we can see it passing through there. Foramen rotundum, we can see it passing through there. And the foramen ovale, we can see it passing through there to get down to the jaw. And you can see how it goes to these muscles to tell them to do their action, etc. So that's called trigeminal nerve because it has 3 branches. Abducens. This is another weird one. 6 extrinsic eye muscles. And now what are we looking at? 1 cranial nerve that tells that lateral rectus muscle out here on the sides when to contract, when to pull the eye to the side. So that is the abducens. That's number 6. Number 7 is the facial nerve. Facial nerve, when we see, has a bunch of different branches as well, not just 3 like we saw with the trigeminal, but now it has 5 different major branches that are going to innervate the face. So you don't have to know all those different ones. You see the hand on the face like that, showing how it's going to, more like that, how the branches are going to route to different muscles around the face and neck, but the facial nerve, in a very general way, innervates the face. 8, vestibulocochlear nerve. Now this one's all in the name, like some of the other ones, right? So the vestibule is an area of the inner ear where it houses the receptors associated with equilibrium. So there's the vestibule, and so it's got sensory information coming from that, so you can tell when your body's positioned or when you're spinning or something like that. The cochlea part means that we have a branch going to this snail-shaped organ here, which allows us to hear. So the vestibulocochlear nerve routes us information for hearing as well as equilibrium. 9. Not no in German, but 9 is glossopharyngeal. When we break that one down, what we find is glosso means tongue, and pharyngeal is talking about the pharynx, right? So we talked about different areas of the body. So this is innervating the tongue and the pharynx. It's a mixed nerve, so it's going to get sensory information coming in, motor information going out. We can see, here's a big parotid salivary gland that we'll talk about later. Remember how we talked about autonomic nervous system and innervating things like the salivary glands, sympathetic and parasympathetic? We can get pathways that can go over here as well. Sensory coming in, motor going out. Vagus. So, not Las Vegas. This is cranial nerve number 10. The vagus nerve is one of the rare cranial nerves originating in the brain that goes down away from the head and neck. So this one goes down into the chest. And take a look at that, right? So you see through the jugular foramen that we learned about before, this one has all kinds of fibers going to all kinds of different organs. Now when we look at this, right, that's telling us, these organs are not somatic, these are autonomic. And so we see a lot of parasympathetic stimulation to these organs, right? Rest and digest. And you can see there's a lot of digestive organs associated there. So it's both motor going out as well as some sensory from these organs coming in. Accessory. Accessory, you're looking at that, you're going, I don't know. But take a look at where it's going. So the accessory, see how it's going to some of the nerves? So we see the trapezius muscle, going to some of the muscles, a nerve going to the muscle, trapezius muscle, and the sternocleidomastoid. So what we find is here, it is a mixed nerve again, but it's primarily motor and function, stimulating these muscles when to contract. Remember how we talked about sternocleidomastoid? You can go yes, you can turn your head no. This is the nerve that's telling it to do that, as well as the trapezius muscle as well. Last one, hypoglossal. Remember, glossal means tongue. Hypoglossal, this is a lot of motor function that's going and innervating the bottom of the tongue. So to be able to move it, right, when you're chewing and things like that, as well as when you're speaking and things like that. And it also gives you sensory information. So that's cranial nerve number 12, hypoglossal. That's the AH, accessory, and then hypoglossal. And there are those 12 cranial nerves again. So when we look at these, remember that a lot of the cranial nerves that we have are mixed nerves. A lot of the nerves that we have are mixed nerves as well. Here's another mnemonic. Some say marry money, but my brother believes it's bad business to marry money. If you look at most of the beginning of those words, it tells you whether of those 12 cranial nerves, whether they are sensory, motor, or both, right? So, olfactory, sensory, what's that? Optic, sensory, coming from the eye. Motor, oculomotor, going to the eye muscles, right? So that also helps you to do a quick and dirty, okay, is it sensory, motor, or mixed, like we were going through before. All right, so at this point, we've been talking quite a bit about relaying this information into the body and perceiving it and things like that. Talking about nerve structure. We started talking about cranial nerves, of which there are 24, 12 pair. So make sure that you know the names of them, what they're innervating, etc. So we're going to stop there because that's a fair amount of information, and we'll continue on with spinal nerves.